Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time to a place where the concept of a weekend getaway didn't exist. Forget your GPS, forget your air-conditioned car, and definitely forget about a hotel with room service. We're going to trudge along with the medieval peasant. You're lacing up your rough leather boots, or maybe just wrapping your feet in rags, because shoes are a luxury. The road ahead isn't paved, it's a muddy, rutted track barely wide enough for a donkey. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. You're not just walking, you're surviving. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of your small pack on your shoulders, a meager bundle of dried bread and perhaps a bit of cheese wrapped in cloth. The sun is already low, casting long the distorted shadows of the trees that line the narrow path. A breeze rustles the leaves above, a sound that, for a moment, almost feels calming. But you know better. Every rustle could be a sign of something or someone else on the road. For the vast majority of peasants in medieval Europe, travel was a luxury, a necessity, or an absolute last resort. A mainstream historical fact is that a peasant's life was tied to their land, often a small plot held by a lord under the feudal system. They didn't just decide to take a trip to a neighbouring town for fun. Their entire existence was a cycle of planting, harvesting, and paying dues, all within a few miles of their humble hut. Leaving that familiar territory was almost unthinkable and, in many cases, legally forbidden without a lord's permission. So, when a peasant did have to travel, it was almost always for something monumental, a pilgrimage to a holy site, a long-distance trade for a rare item, or perhaps to find work after a poor harvest. The sheer logistics of it were staggering. Without maps, without a common language across vast regions, and without any sort of standardized currency, every journey was a leap of faith. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe that the practice of placing small, carved figures or painted symbols on trees or rocks along well-trodden paths was a form of early folk-based navigation. You might not have a compass, but you could follow a series of crudely drawn suns or arrows, a sort of medieval breadcrumb trail left by past travellers. Of course, historians still argue whether these were true navigational aids or simply superstitious markings. But it's a fun thought to imagine. You feel a pebble under your foot, a sharp point through the thin sole of your shoe. You don't have the luxury of complaint, you just keep moving. The sun dips below the horizon, and the air turns cool, a sharp contrast to the day's warmth. Your mind begins to race with the question of where you'll rest tonight. You can't simply set up a tent, that would make you an easy target. The path isn't a friendly place after dark, it's filled with dangers real and imagined. This is where your first challenge comes in, finding a safe place to lay your head. It's not a cozy inn with a roaring fire and a warm meal. You're lucky if you find a dry patch of ground under a sheltered overhang or, if you're truly fortunate, a kind-hearted soul in a remote farmhouse. The fear of what lies in the darkness is a heavy cloak, much heavier than your pack. A lot of these fears were fueled by the stories people told, tales of forest spirits, vengeful ghosts, and ruthless bandits. Remember that simple reality check I gave you? Well, you probably wouldn't survive this journey alone. That's why you'd almost never see a peasant travelling solo. They would have formed small groups for safety in numbers, sharing the load and the risks, because there was no other way. The road was a gauntlet, and your best shield was the company of others. So, you trudge on, the shadows of the night creeping in, with only the thought of a warm fire, or at least a dry spot, to keep you going. As you press on, your mind drifts to the whispers you've heard about places of rest. Not the grimy, dangerous lean-tos, but actual sanctioned places. You've heard that early inns weren't quite the jolly, ale-soaked havens you might imagine from a storybook. In fact, many were tied to religious institutions. A mainstream historical fact is that one of the earliest forms of organized lodging for travelers was the monastic guest house, monasteries. Scattered across the landscape, were obligated by their religious rules to offer hospitality to travelers, regardless of their social standing. This was a core tenet of Christian charity, so a peasant like you, exhausted and covered in dust, could find a safe place to sleep for the night, often in a communal hall or a simple outbuilding, This was less like a hotel and more like crashing on your aunt's couch. If your aunt happened to be a stern, silent monk, there would be no charge for the lodging, but you'd be expected to show gratitude, perhaps by offering to help with a simple chore, like mucking out a stable or fetching water from the well. This was a form of payment in kind, a subtle exchange that maintained a sense of dignity for both the host and the guest. It was a far cry from the bustling taverns that would come later. Speaking of which, a quirky or fringe tidbit, a few rare monastic records mention that some guest houses had a special hidden room or cell set aside specifically for travellers who had fallen ill, to prevent them from spreading their sickness to the monks. These were essentially the world's first isolation wards, a grim but practical measure to protect the community. Historians still argue whether these were a common practice or just isolated examples of forward-thinking abbots. But it's clear that even then, the threat of disease was a major concern for anyone who ran a public lodging. The air grows colder, and you pull the thin cloak tighter around your shoulders. You pass a small, dilapidated hut, its chimney emitting a faint wisp of smoke, and you get a flash of hope, a thought of a warm fire. But you keep going. You're looking for something more substantial, something that promises a bit more security. These weren't just monasteries. Private homes also served a similar, albeit less formal, role. In many communities, it was considered a social duty to offer a traveller a place to stay. You might knock on the door of a prosperous peasant's home, or even a minor noble's manor, and be given a space in the stable or a corner by the hearth for the night. This was hospitality born of necessity and a shared understanding of the hardships of the road. It was also an opportunity to hear news from the outside world, a welcome exchange for people who rarely left their immediate vicinity. The concept of a guest house in this era was incredibly fluid. It wasn't a commercial enterprise with a swinging sign and a price list. It was a space, a corner, a simple bench, offered with the understanding that one day, you might be the one offering it. The trust involved was immense. You, a total stranger, were being invited into someone's space, and they, in turn, had to trust you. It was a social contract written in the unspoken rules of survival, and if you broke that trust, if you stole or caused trouble, your reputation would spread faster than any news of your arrival. The thought makes you pick up your pace. The path becomes rockier, the ground uneven. You can almost feel the presence of a building ahead, perhaps a barn, or maybe a small house. The moon is a thin sliver in the sky, offering little light. You're tired, your muscles are screaming, and the idea of lying down, even on a pile of straw, is the most beautiful thought in the world. But you know the night is still young, and there are many more miles to go before you can truly rest. You finally see it, a faint, flickering light through the trees. It's a distant beacon of civilization, and for a moment, the ache in your feet lessens. You press forward, your hopes pinned on this small glimmer. The road, as you call it, is more of a suggestion. A mainstream historical fact is that public travel infrastructure, as we know it, simply did not exist. There were no government-funded road crews, no national highway system. The few roads that did exist were often remnants of old Roman roads, or they were simply beaten-down paths created by the repeated passage of people, animals, and carts. These were not maintained. They were subjected to the whims of the weather and the passage of time. You splash through a deep, muddy rut, the kind that could easily swallow a cartwheel whole. The sound is a squelching slur and a little of the cold. Dirty water soaks through the thin sole of your shoe, making you shiver. This is the reality of medieval travel, a constant battle against the elements and the terrain itself. You might have to climb over a fallen tree or ford a small stream because there was no bridge. It was all a matter of brute force and patience. The most well-travelled routes were often those connecting major towns or pilgrimage sites, but even these would have been what we would consider little more than dirt tracks today. And they were used by everyone, not just travellers, but also local farmers moving livestock, peddlers with their goods, and the occasional noble on horseback. A quirky or fringe tidbit. Some historians theorize that in certain regions, villagers would take turns dragging large, heavy logs along particularly bad stretches of road to try and smooth them out. A form of communal road maintenance. This wasn't a planned, organized effort, but a spontaneous act of a community trying to make life a little easier. It's a sweet thought, isn't it, that people would band together just to make the path a little less treacherous for each other, of course. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just another one of those hopeful historical whispers. But it speaks to the spirit of a world where survival was a shared endeavor. You finally reach the edge of a small hamlet, the firelight now bright enough to cast shadows of the huts on the road. The air smells of wood smoke and roasting meat, a scent that makes your stomach rumble in protest. The soundscape here is different from the silent, ominous woods. You can hear the distant murmur of voices, a dog barking, and the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. It's the sound of people living their lives, a comfort after so long alone. And as you walk down the main, muddy lane, you realize that for a peasant like you, these roads functioned as more than just a means of getting from place to place. They were social arteries. They were places where you'd trade news with a passing traveller, hear a bawdy joke from a cart driver, or get a warning about a dangerous stretch of road ahead. The road was a living thing, a network of whispers and stories that flowed between communities. You might hear about a fair happening in the next town over, or news of a lord raising taxes. The road was the internet of its time, a slow, physical stream of information. The path you walk on isn't just mud and rocks, it's a tapestry of shared human experience. You're not just a single person on a journey, you're part of a grander, slower, and much smellier procession of humanity. And with that thought, you knock tentatively on the first door that looks like it might offer a warm hearth and a safe corner for the night. The door creaks open, and a woman with weary eyes and flour on her apron peers out at you. You offer a simple greeting, explain your journey, and, with a subtle shift in her expression, she invites you in. A mainstream historical fact is that staying with family or friends was the primary, most reliable option for any peasant who needed to travel. The social ties of kinship extended far beyond a single village. Families were often spread across multiple hamlets or even further, and a journey was often a chance to reinforce these bonds. But what if you had no family nearby? This is where the wider network of hospitality came into play. A system built on mutual respect and the understanding that one day, you might be the one in need. This isn't just about charity, it's about a deep, practical social contract. And you see, a traveller wasn't just a stranger, they were a source of news, a living link to the outside world. This created a powerful incentive for villagers to be hospitable. They could hear news of harvests in other regions, learn about new tools, or simply listen to a story from someone who had seen more of the world than they had. This exchange of information was as valuable as any coin, a quirky or fringe tidbit. There's evidence from some folk tales and medieval legal texts that a traveller who was refused a place to stay could sometimes appeal to the local lord or priest, and the inhospitable family might face social censure or even a small fine. The expectation of offering aid was that deeply ingrained in the culture. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just a concept used to shame those who were particularly greedy, but it highlights just how much value was placed on generosity. You're led to a corner by the hearth, a space already occupied by a large, sleepy dog. The woman's husband, a robust man with calloused hands, nods a greeting. You feel the warmth of the fire on your face, and the simple act of sitting down is a luxury your exhausted body welcomes. You share what little food you have, and they offer you a bowl of thick, warm porridge in return. The conversation is slow, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the low snores of the dog. You tell them about your journey, and they ask you questions about the world beyond their small village. It's a transaction of information and kindness, a beautiful example of a world without hotels or paid lodging. Remember that earlier thought about the internet of the time? This is it in its purest form, a simple human exchange. The trust required for this sort of hospitality was immense, and it wasn't always a flawless system. There were undoubtedly cases of travellers who took advantage of their hosts, and hosts who were less than kind, but for the most part, the system worked because it had to. It was a matter of survival. You wouldn't just be a guest, you'd be a temporary member of the household. You might be asked to help with a small chore the next morning before you leave, and you'd likely share a communal sleeping space. The concept of personal privacy wasn't quite what it is today. The communal aspect of life extended to the sleeping quarters. You'd find yourself sleeping on the floor or on a bed shared with several others. But it would be a warm and safe spot, and that was all that mattered. The kindness of strangers, in a world where strangers were often feared, was a currency more valuable than silver. After a good night's rest in the warmth of the hearth, you're back on the road. The sun is just starting to peek over the horizon, and the air is crisp. But as the path curves and the trees close in, you feel a prickle of unease. You're alone now, and the silence of the woods feels heavier. This is why a mainstream historical fact is that traveling alone was considered extremely dangerous. A risk few would take unless absolutely necessary. The roads and paths were not patrolled, and the wilderness between settlements was a lawless, often unforgiving place. The primary reason for this danger was the threat of bandits, highwaymen, and other outlaws who preyed on the vulnerable. But it wasn't just the human element you had to worry about. The wilderness itself was full of hazards. You could get lost, fall ill, or suffer an injury far from any help. A lone traveller was a feast for opportunistic predators of both the two-legged and four-legged variety. This is why peasants, when forced to travel, would almost always form small groups. It was a matter of safety in numbers. They would pool their meagre resources, share the load of watching for danger, and provide a support system for one another. You'd probably trudge along with a couple of other farmers from your village. Or perhaps you'd join a small band of travelling artisans, or even a family on their way to a market. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians speculate that the tradition of folk songs and ballads often told on the road served a practical purpose beyond entertainment. By singing, or simply making noise, travellers could signal their presence to other groups or potential hosts. But more importantly, it could alert them to dangers ahead or scare off wild animals. It was an audible form of protection. Imagine a group of tired peasants walking along, their voices harmonizing a simple, repetitive tune, not just to pass the time but to make sure a lurking bandit knew there was more than one person to contend with. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious survival tactic or just something people did naturally to ward off boredom and fear, but it's a lovely thought, isn't it? That a simple song could be a shield. You think about the feeling of safety you had last night, a feeling provided by the company of a family, however temporary. Now, walking by yourself, you feel the vulnerability of your position. Every snapping twig or rustle in the bushes makes you tense up. You know the stories, tales of people disappearing without a trace, of being waylaid and robbed of their last penny, or worse. The fear isn't just of losing your belongings, it's of losing your life. The forest around you, with its dark, tangled undergrowth, seems to be watching. It's a silent, ominous presence. A constant reminder of why you shouldn't be here alone. This is a world where community isn't just a nice idea, it's a life-saving necessity. The people you travel with aren't just companions, they are your security system, your emergency response team, and your human shield. You're all in the same leaky boat, and the only way to get to shore is to paddle together. This collaborative spirit, born of hardship, is what made long-distance travel for the poor even remotely possible. So you quicken your pace, hoping to catch up with a group you saw leaving the hamlet just a little while ago. You're not looking for a friend, you're looking for a partner in survival. The road is a gauntlet, and you know you'll have a much better chance of reaching your destination with a few other runners beside you. Now that you've had a taste of the dangers, you start to understand why the forest isn't just a place of trees and squirrels. It's the setting for every scary story you've ever heard. A mainstream historical fact is that folk tales and legends were not just for entertainment, they played a significant role in shaping a peasant's perception of the world and their fears of travel. These stories weren't just about dragons and knights, they were often cautionary tales about the very real dangers that lurked just beyond the village boundaries. You'd hear stories of forest spirits, vengeful ghosts, or grotesque creatures that would lead travelers astray. These legends were a way of explaining the unexplainable, the disappearance of a traveller, a sudden illness, or the unsettling sounds of the night. You can almost hear your grandmother's voice, warning you about the barrow wights that guard ancient burial mounds, or the malicious sprites that twist the path and make you walk in circles. You think back to the stories you told around the fire as a child, tales of the green man of the forest, a spirit who could be a protector or a terror depending on his mood. These stories were woven into the very fabric of travel. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some regions, travelers would perform small rituals before entering a deep forest, leaving a small offering of bread or a coin on a stone, or simply muttering a prayer to appease the local spirits. This wasn't necessarily a sign of blind superstition, but a practical way of psychologically preparing for a journey into the unknown. It gave them a sense of control over a world that felt chaotic and terrifying. Historians still argue whether these were genuine religious acts or simply a form of social tradition. But it's clear they were a big part of the travel experience. As you walk, every creak of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth is a potential monster from a story. You're not just walking through a forest, you're walking through a landscape of shared fears and anxieties. The darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's a place where ghouls and goblins might be waiting. This emotional and psychological burden was a constant travel companion. It made a long journey not just physically grueling, but mentally draining. You had to be on guard not just for bandits, but for the things that went bump in the night, the things your parents told you about to keep you from wandering too far. Remember those fleeting moments of fear you had back in Section 5? This is what fueled them. The legends also served a more practical purpose. They reinforced the idea that you shouldn't be traveling alone. The monsters in the stories were often defeated by a group of heroes, not a single person. So, they were not just a source of fear, but a subconscious push towards forming the travel groups that were essential for survival. It's a kind of beautiful, if a little terrifying, irony. The very things that made you scared to travel alone were the things that forced you to seek the company of others, making your journey safer, so you keep your eyes peeled, not just for a well-beaten path, but for any sign of other travelers, because you know that a living, breathing companion is a much better ward against the things in the dark than any old folk tale. And with that thought, a rustle in the bushes ahead makes your heart leap, until you see it's just a harmless deer, and you let out a soft, shaky breath. With the dawn of a new day, your journey takes on a more deliberate purpose. You're not just wandering anymore, you're heading somewhere specific. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Pilgrimages were one of the most common and important reasons for a peasant to undertake a long-distance journey. They weren't just a leisurely walk, they were a profound act of religious devotion, a way to seek atonement for sins, give thanks for a blessing, or pray for a cure from a sickness. The destination was often a holy site, a shrine, or a church that held a significant relic. These were not short trips. They could last for weeks or even months, pushing a peasant to the absolute limits of their endurance. Imagine the sheer motivation it would take. You're leaving your home, your family, and the only life you've ever known, all for a belief. You would have likely saved every spare coin you had for years just to make the trip possible. The hope of a miracle or a blessing from a saint was a powerful motivator, a force that could make a person endure incredible hardship. You'd probably be carrying a small token, perhaps a piece of cloth that had touched a local shrine, or a simple prayer bead to keep your faith strong on the road. This journey wasn't just physical, it was deeply spiritual. You'd probably be walking with other pilgrims, a small community of shared purpose. You'd sing hymns, recite prayers, and share stories of faith, which made the difficult miles a little more bearable. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain pilgrimage routes were deliberately designed to be challenging, with steep climbs and long, exposed stretches, to make the journey a form of penance in itself. It was as if the struggle of the trip was part of the worship, a way to show your devotion. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious design choice or simply a result of the most direct path being the most difficult, but it highlights the immense physical and mental demands of such a journey. As you walk, you join a small group of pilgrims, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and hope. You're not just a tired traveler anymore, you're a fellow believer on a shared quest. You share your meager food, and they share theirs. You point out a particularly difficult part of the path, and they offer you a hand to help you climb it. This sense of camaraderie among pilgrims was a powerful force that made these journeys possible. It was a network of faith that transcended social status. A rich merchant might find themselves walking alongside a humble peasant, their shared destination a powerful equalizer. The path ahead of you is long and uncertain, but with every step, you feel the weight of your spiritual purpose. The fear of bandits and the anxieties of the unknown are still there, but they're tempered by the sense that you're doing this for something greater than yourself. You're part of a grand tradition, a continuous line of pilgrims that stretches back for centuries. The road isn't just a path of mud and rocks, it's a sacred way, and you're just one more person treading it, hoping for a blessing at the end. The journey is the prayer, and every step is a verse. With your pilgrimage now underway, you're not just walking through the countryside, you're entering a world shaped by commerce and trade. A mainstream historical fact is that the rise of market towns and regional trade hubs fundamentally changed the nature of travel for peasants. These were not just places for buying and selling, they were nodes in a vast network of human movement. A farmer might travel for days to get to a market town to sell a single goat or a few sacks of grain. An act that would have been a once-a-year major event. These towns, often located at crossroads or along major rivers, became magnets for anyone looking to trade, find work, or simply get a taste of a life beyond their village. You can feel the difference as you get closer to one of these towns. The path, once a narrow dirt track, widens to accommodate more traffic. You see more carts, more people, and a palpable sense of purpose in the air. The smells change from damp earth and wild foliage to a mix of wood smoke, livestock, and the savory scent of cooked food from a roadside vendor. You might even see a peddler with a cart full of goods, shouting their wares. A sight that would be as exciting to you as seeing a new smartphone for the first time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some market towns had specific travelers' lanes or designated paths for people coming in and out. A sort of medieval traffic control system to prevent congestion. These were often a bit wider and less muddy than the main roads, and they would be maintained by the town's guild. Historians still argue whether these were for the benefit of the travellers or simply to keep the smelly peasants away from the more prosperous merchants, but either way, they show a growing awareness of the logistical challenges of mass movement. The market town itself is a chaotic, vibrant hub of activity. There's a cacophony of sounds, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of vendors, the clang of a blacksmith, and the general hum of hundreds of people talking at once. For a peasant used to the quiet rhythm of the countryside, it would be an overwhelming sensory overload. And yet, it's also a place of opportunity, a place where you might meet someone from a distant land, hear a strange new language, or even find a small job that could earn you a few extra coins for your journey. This is where you might find your first real inn, a place not tied to a monastery or a generous homeowner, but a place that operates as a business. Remember that simple home you stayed in a few nights ago? That's the old way. This is the new. These market towns fundamentally changed the nature of peasant travel. It became less about simply surviving from one place to the next and more about engaging in a larger economy. The journey itself became part of a larger commercial system, a slow, arduous but necessary component of trade. Your trek is no longer just about getting from point A to point B. It's about participating in a grander procession of people and goods that keeps the world turning. And as you walk into the bustling town square, you feel like you've stepped into a different world entirely. You've arrived in the market town, and the first thing you notice isn't the crowds or the smells, but the buildings dedicated solely to lodging. A mainstream historical fact is that these early inns were much more than just a place to sleep. They were multifaceted hubs that served a variety of functions for both travellers and the local community. They were essentially the community centres of their day. You'd find them along major roads or in the centre of a town, marked by a recognisable sign, perhaps a carved animal or a painted symbol, because most people couldn't read. These inns offered more than just a place to lay your head. They were a central point for news and gossip. The innkeeper would be a crucial source of information, a human bulletin board who could tell you about the state of the roads ahead, recent political happenings, or if there was a good master looking for workers in the next town. They also provided a place to eat and drink. You wouldn't just be getting a bed, you'd be getting a simple, warm meal, often stew or bread and cheese, and a place to sit by the fire. The cost was minimal, but it was a transaction, a business, unlike the hospitality of a monastery. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of these early inns would often have a small space set aside for a local barber or a leech, a type of early medical practitioner. They'd set up shop in the corner, offering to pull teeth, bleed patients, or stitch up minor wounds. It was a one-stop shop for a traveller in need. So, You might be grabbing a pint of ale next to a guy getting a tooth pulled. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an opportunistic act on the part of the barber, but it shows how these inns became miniature service stations for a transient population. The atmosphere inside the inn is a stark contrast to the quiet, familial warmth of the private home you stayed in earlier. This place is bustling, loud, and full of a diverse group of people. There are merchants haggling, pilgrims whispering prayers in a corner, and maybe a few soldiers or mercenaries drinking and telling tall tales. The air is thick with the smell of stale ale, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. You might find a space on a long communal table, where you'd sit and eat with total strangers. The conversation would be a mix of different dialects and languages, a true melting pot of the medieval world. The inn was also a place for business. You might be able to find a work exchange, offering a day of labour in the inn's stables in exchange for a night's lodging. This was a common practice for poor travellers who couldn't afford the small fee. Remember that earlier conversation about hospitality? The inn is a different beast entirely. It's a commercial enterprise, a business transaction, a place where services are exchanged for value. It's a key milestone in the development of travel infrastructure, a step away from a world of communal aid and toward a world of paid services. You're not a guest here, you're a customer. And that, in its own way, is both a freeing and a slightly lonely feeling. The next morning, you wake up on a rough mattress, crammed into a large room with a dozen other snoring travellers. You pay the small fee, perhaps a handful of coins or a small part of the bread you carried, and you're back on the road. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The cost of lodging was a major hurdle for poor travellers. Unlike the free hospitality of a monastery or a generous homeowner, inns and taverns operated on a simple principle. You had to pay to stay for a peasant, who might only see a few coins in an entire year. A single night's lodging could represent a significant portion of their meagre savings. This is why you would rarely see a peasant stay in an inn for more than a single night. The system of payment could be complex. It wasn't always just about money. The concept of bartering was common. A peasant might offer a service in exchange for lodging, perhaps a day of work in the stables, mending a fence, or helping the innkeeper's wife with chores. The innkeeper would weigh the value of the labour against the cost of the bed and the simple meal. This was a form of mutual exchange that kept the economy of the road moving. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some inns had a system where you could leave a piece of personal property as a form of collateral, a sort of medieval pawn shop. You might leave your cloak or a precious tool, which you would then redeem with a few coins on your way out. It was a risky game, and historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few desperate travellers and opportunistic innkeepers. You feel the weight of this economic reality. The simple act of finding a place to sleep is now a financial transaction. The money in your small pouch feels heavier now, more precious. You know that every coin you spend is a coin you can't use for a new tool or a small gift for your family when you return. This pressure meant that the vast majority of peasants would still opt for a place to sleep in the open or seek out the kindness of strangers, only using an inn as a last resort in a town where there were no other options. The inn was a symbol of a rising commercial world, a world that was still largely out of reach for the common person. Remember that earlier feeling of trust and shared humanity from the private home? The inn is different. It's colder, more transactional. You're just another traveller passing through, a number on a ledger, a temporary source of income. This is not to say that innkeepers were all heartless. Many were kind and fair, but the fundamental relationship was one of business, not charity. And as you walk away from the bustling town, leaving the noise and the smells of commerce behind, you feel a sense of relief. You're back on the open road, where the rules are simpler, and the kindness of strangers is its own reward. The journey there, for a poor peasant, was a constant negotiation between the old world of mutual aid and the new world of commerce. You're back on the open road, but it's not truly open. It's a landscape of obligations and permissions. A mainstream historical fact is that a peasant's ability to travel was often not their own. It was a right that was granted or denied by their feudal lord. Under the feudal system, you were essentially tied to the land, a kind of walking, talking asset of your lord's estate. To leave the land, you would likely need your lord's permission, and even then, your journey would be under a watchful eye. The lord might grant you a charter or a simple letter to show anyone who asked why you were on the road and where you were going. Without this, you could be seen as a runaway serf, a beggar, or a vagrant, and you would be in serious trouble. The Lord's motivation was simple: your labor was valuable. Without it, their fields would go unplowed, their taxes would go unpaid, and their power would diminish. They had every reason to keep you close to the land. This control wasn't just about the physical space, it was about the very fabric of your life. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some regions, a peasant would have to pay a small travel tax to their lord for the privilege of leaving the manor. This was a way for the lord to maintain a degree of control and also to profit from your journey. It was a clear-cut transaction. You pay to leave, and you're granted a brief taste of freedom. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a particularly greedy lord, but it speaks to the immense power held by the landed gentry. You can feel this weight of control with every step. You're not just a person on a journey, you're a subject of a powerful lord. A piece of his larger puzzle. You might be carrying a small, rolled-up parchment with a lord's seal on it, a kind of medieval passport that vouches for your identity and purpose. This would be your most valuable possession, more important than any coin or food. The thought of losing it is terrifying because without it, you're nobody. A person without a place in a world that demands that everyone have one. This system of control extended to every aspect of a peasant's life, even when on a pilgrimage, which was generally seen as a holy and protected act. You might still need your lord's permission. The church and the nobility often had a tense relationship, and the lord's authority was not something to be trifled with. Your journey, no matter how pure your intentions, was still seen through the lens of power and control. And as you walk, you feel the invisible chains of this system, a constant reminder that your life and your journey are not entirely your own. The journey continues, but now you're back on a well-worn path, a sign you're nearing a place of sanctuary. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries were a crucial part of the medieval travel network, offering not just a place to sleep but also a sense of security and spiritual respite. Remember the fleeting glimpse of monastic hospitality we touched on earlier? Well, this is the full picture. The monastic rule of hospitality, often based on the teachings of Saint Benedict, was a fundamental part of a monk's duty. The saying went, "All guests who arrive should be received like Christ." This was a profound spiritual obligation, not just a casual act of kindness. You approach a large stone building, its high walls and single arched gate a stark contrast to the small, muddy villages you've passed through. The atmosphere inside the monastery is one of quiet contemplation and order. You're led to a guest house, often a separate building with a large communal hall where you and other travellers would lay down your bedrolls. The monks, silent and purposeful, offer you a simple meal of bread, cheese, and water, or perhaps a bowl of lentil stew. The food is plain but nourishing, and the quiet dignity of the monks is a soothing presence after the noise and chaos of the road. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some monasteries kept a traveller's log or register, a simple record of who came and went, often with a small note about their journey or the purpose of their visit. This wasn't a legal document, but more of a social record, a way for the monks to keep track of the flow of humanity that passed through their doors. It was also a way to remember those who were particularly generous or who had a fascinating story to tell. Historians still argue whether these logs were for a practical purpose or simply a way for the monks to connect with the outside world, but they offer a tantalizing glimpse into the rhythm of medieval travel. The monastery was more than just a place to sleep. It was a place of healing, both physical and spiritual. You might have found a small infirmary where a monk with some knowledge of herbs could tend to your blistered feet or a nagging cough. You could attend a prayer service, a quiet moment to reflect on your journey and your purpose. For a peasant like you, who was likely under the constant stress of labor and survival, this brief respite in a place of peace and plenty was a profound luxury. It was a reminder that there was a world beyond the mud and the toil, a world of prayer and contemplation. The monastery's hospitality was a two-way street, though, while there was no formal charge, you would be expected to offer a small act of service or a donation if you could afford it. You might spend the morning chopping wood, working in the garden, or helping with the washing. This act of giving back was a way of showing your gratitude and was also a way for the monastery to manage the constant flow of people without going broke. You're not a customer here, you're a guest, a temporary part of a larger, spiritual community. After a peaceful night in the monastery, you're back on the road, but this time, you're not heading to another quiet refuge. The smell of ale and the sound of boisterous laughter drift on the wind, a sign you're approaching a different kind of lodging, the local tavern. A mainstream historical fact is that taverns and alehouses were a more common and accessible option for travellers, especially those who couldn't rely on monastic hospitality or private charity. These were often run by a local family, and while they offered lodging, their primary business was serving drinks and simple food to the local community. For a traveller, they were a chance to blend in and get a sense of local life. As you enter, the atmosphere is a jarring contrast to the quiet of the monastery. It's loud, smoky, and filled with a mix of people, farmers, craftsmen, and other travellers just like you. The air is thick with the scent of cheap ale, wood smoke, and sweat. The seating is likely a series of long, communal tables and benches. You might find yourself crammed between a loud farmer and a grizzled-looking merchant. The conversation is a mix of gossip, local news, and drunken songs. This is not a place for quiet reflection, it's a place for a rowdy social scene. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many taverns had a special, unofficial role as a sort of medieval job board. Travellers would gather there and hear about opportunities for day labour from local landowners or merchants. It was a place where you could network and find a way to earn a few coins for the next leg of your journey. So, you might be nursing a pint of ale, overhearing a conversation about a lord who needs hands for the harvest, or a craftsman who is looking for an apprentice. Historians still argue whether this was a formal system or just a natural consequence of so many people gathering in one place. But it was undoubtedly a crucial part of the road economy. The tavern offered a place to sleep, but it was far from luxurious. You'd likely be given a spot on the floor in the main hall, or perhaps in a communal sleeping loft upstairs. You would be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with other travellers, and the noise and smells of the tavern would follow you throughout the night. It was a kind of controlled chaos, a place of temporary community forged in the shared experience of travel and drink. This was also a place where you could hear the stories of the road from a different perspective. While the monastery offered a spiritual account of travel, the tavern offered a more grounded and often more cynical one. You'd hear tales of botched heists, shady deals, and corrupt lords. The tavern was a place of a different kind of truth, a more earthy, less pious one, and as you sit there, sipping on a simple, sour ale, you feel the gritty reality of the road wash over you. You've spent a night at the tavern, and you can still smell the stale ale and wood smoke on your clothes. As you walk out, you feel a sense of relief to be back in the fresh, if muddy, air. This is a good time to consider a mainstream historical fact. The sanitation in these early places of lodging was, by modern standards, absolutely awful. There was no concept of a separate guest room with a private bath. The accommodations were almost always communal, and the conditions were a breeding ground for pests and disease. The straw on the floor or the mattresses was rarely changed, and it would have been home to fleas, lice, and other unpleasant creatures. You would have likely slept with your boots on and your pack clutched close to your chest, not just for safety, but also to avoid direct contact with the grimy surroundings. The privy, if one even existed, would be an outhouse or a hole dug in the ground, and the smell would be a constant presence. There was no running water, so washing was a rare and difficult affair. It was a world where you simply accepted the presence of filth as a part of life. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some records suggest that innkeepers would occasionally throw a handful of herbs or fragrant leaves on the floor to try and mask the terrible smells. It was a kind of primitive air freshener, a fleeting attempt to make the place more palatable. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a particularly fastidious innkeeper, but it speaks to the challenge of managing a place that was constantly filled with people and animals. You think about the simple cleanliness of the monastery you stayed in, with its clear, orderly courtyards and its small, private latrines. That was a world of order and discipline. The tavern, by contrast, was a world of chaos and grime, and the journey itself would be a constant battle against dirt. Your clothes would be caked in mud, your hands and face would be perpetually grimy, and your feet would be blistered and sore. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp clothes would be a constant companion on your travels. This lack of sanitation had real-world consequences. Disease spread rapidly in these close quarters. And a simple cold could turn into a life-threatening illness. You knew that every time you shared a cup or a plate, you were taking a risk. The journey was not just a physical challenge, it was a constant immunological test. The thought makes you pick up your pace. The smell of the tavern behind you and the hope of a fresh breeze ahead, you're back on the road, and the thought of last night's communal sleeping arrangements makes you shiver. It was a close quarters experience, and it's a mainstream historical fact that you would likely share a bed with strangers. This wasn't a choice for intimacy or companionship, it was a matter of space and economics. Inns were not built with individual rooms. They had large, communal sleeping areas or lofts where beds, if they existed at all, were placed side by side. The idea of a private room with a door that locked was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. And even then it was rare. You would be assigned a spot on the bed, and you would be expected to share it with other travelers, regardless of their gender, social class, or hygiene. You would undress only slightly, maybe just taking off your boots, and you would sleep in your undergarments or the clothes you wore all day. The bed was a temporary refuge, a place to rest your bones for a few hours before you were back on the road. The lack of personal space and the constant presence of others was a normal part of life, and it's a good example of how differently people viewed privacy in the past. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that there were specific rules for who got to sleep where on the bed. The most senior or important person would get the top of the bed, the spot farthest from the door, which was considered the safest. The newest or least important person would get the spot closest to the door, which was the coldest and most exposed. Historians still argue whether this was a formal system or just a matter of social etiquette, but it speaks to the deep-seated hierarchy of the time. This lack of privacy was a constant reminder of your place in the world. You were a traveller, a transient person without a home, and your temporary refuge was a space you had to share with everyone else. You would fall asleep to the sounds of snoring, coughing, and the rustling of other people's bodies. It wasn't a restful experience, but it was better than sleeping in a ditch. The communal sleeping arrangements also had a very real risk. You were sleeping next to total strangers, and you had no idea if they were honest or not. You would have kept your small bag of belongings clutched tightly in your arms, an act of self-preservation in a world where you couldn't trust anyone. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a place of vulnerability. A place where you had to be constantly on guard, your back on the open road, the sensation of your feet striking the ground a constant, rhythmic ache. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. For the vast majority of peasants, horses were a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The very idea of a peasant owning a horse for travel was almost unheard of. A peasant might have a donkey or an ox to pull a plough or a cart, but a horse was a different beast entirely. It was a symbol of status, speed, and power, and it came with a hefty price tag, not just for the animal itself, but for its feed, care, and equipment. This meant that your journey was a slow, deliberate trudge on foot. You would walk for miles, day after day, your progress measured in blisters and the sun's position in the sky. Your feet were your only engine, your legs your only transportation. This reliance on walking shaped the entire experience of travel. It meant that every journey was a physical ordeal, a test of endurance. You had to plan your route not just based on the destination, but on the distance you could reasonably cover in a day. You couldn't just get up and go, you had to calculate your pace, your rest stops, and your food and water supplies with a meticulous precision. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some peasants would fashion a kind of primitive backpack out of woven reeds or animal hides, a contraption designed to distribute the weight of their belongings more evenly across their back. This was a form of ingenious, low-tech engineering, a way to make the long walks a little less brutal. Historians still argue whether these were common or just a clever solution for a few particularly resourceful travelers, but they highlight the ingenuity born of necessity. The physical toll of this kind of travel was immense. Your feet would be a constant source of pain, your muscles would ache, and your body would be in a perpetual state of exhaustion. The journey was not just a means to an end, it was the story itself. A narrative written in the pain of your legs and the dust on your clothes. Remember the luxury of riding in a car? Well, your body is your car. And it's a manual transmission with no suspension. The journey was a constant, intimate negotiation with the physical world, a world of mud, rocks, and uneven terrain. This is a key part of what made peasant travel so different from the journeys of the wealthy. A lord on a horse would ride from one estate to the next, covering vast distances in a short amount of time, a blur of speed and power. You, a peasant, would experience every single mile of that same journey, a slow, methodical march through the landscape. The road was not just a path, it was a physical and spiritual challenge, a constant reminder of your place in the world and the sheer effort it took to get anywhere in it with every step. You find yourself on a journey that is as much internal as it is external. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The mental and psychological challenges of medieval travel were just as significant as the physical ones. You're not just battling the elements and the road, you're also wrestling with boredom, loneliness, and the constant, nagging anxiety of the unknown. The days are long and repetitive, a monotonous rhythm of walking, eating, and sleeping. There's no music to listen to, no podcast to distract you. You are alone with your thoughts, a constant, low-level hum of worry and introspection. This is a world without instant communication. The people you leave behind are gone, and you won't know their fate until you return, if you ever do. The lack of news from home would be a heavy weight. Did your crops come in? Is your family well? These questions would loop in your mind, a constant source of stress. The journey becomes a kind of forced meditation, a long, drawn-out process of confronting your own fears and your place in the world. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians speculate that the practice of telling stories and singing songs on the road was not just for entertainment, but was a way to stave off the psychological toll of the journey. By sharing tales and ballads, travelers could create a temporary, shared reality that was more comforting than the harsh truth of the road. It was a form of communal therapy, a way to use the power of narrative to combat the fear and loneliness. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious effort or a natural byproduct of a society that relied on oral tradition. But it's clear that storytelling was a life-sustaining act. The mental challenges were also tied to the physical ones. The constant pain and exhaustion would wear down your will. You would be tempted to give up, to turn back, to simply lie down and let the journey end. The journey was a battle against your own mind, a test of your resolve, and every day you would have to find a new source of motivation, a reason to put one foot in front of the other. The destination was not just a physical place, it was a psychological finish line, a point where the mental and physical torture would finally end. The journey was the story, and the real enemy wasn't the bandit or the storm, it was the despair in your own mind. Your stomach growls, a sharp reminder of the physical demands of your journey. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Peasant food on the road was simple, practical, and designed for survival, not enjoyment. You wouldn't be stopping for a hot meal at a cafe. Your meals would consist of food that was easily portable, didn't spoil quickly, and was as calorie-dense as possible. Your pack would contain staples like hard cheese, salted meat, and dried bread, or a hard biscuit called a ship's biscuit, or hard tack. These foods were a far cry from the fresh stews and roasted meats you might eat at home, but they provided the necessary energy to keep you walking for miles on end. The journey was a constant negotiation with hunger. You would eat small amounts throughout the day, a bit of cheese here, a piece of bread there, just enough to keep the engine running. Water was a constant concern. You would drink from streams or rivers, a risky business that could lead to sickness, or from a well in a village you passed through. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some travellers would carry a small amount of vinegar in a flask. A few drops added to a questionable water source was believed to make it safer to drink, a kind of primitive purification method. Historians still argue whether this was a truly effective method or just a placebo. But it highlights the desperation of a traveller trying to avoid a debilitating illness on the road. The ritual of eating on the road was a simple one. You would find a sheltered spot, perhaps under a large tree or a rock overhang, and you would eat your meal in silence. It was not a social event, but a solitary act of survival. You would have to be careful not to waste a single crumb, as every bit of food was precious. Remember that home-cooked meal you had a few nights ago? That was a luxury. This is reality. The food was fuel, nothing more, and its blandness was a constant reminder of your situation. This is a key part of the peasant travel experience. The lack of a varied diet and the constant reliance on simple, preserved foods meant that the journey was not just physically and mentally taxing, but nutritionally so. You would arrive at your destination thinner and more gaunt than when you left. The journey was a kind of fast, a long period of deprivation that was broken only when you finally reached your destination. It was a test of your body's ability to survive on the bare minimum. The journey continues. But now it's not just a physical act, it's a form of political expression. A mainstream historical fact is that peasant travel, especially in the form of mass migration or collective journeys, could be a form of protest. While a single peasant's journey was often an act of desperation or faith, a large-scale movement of people could send a powerful message to a lord or a king. Peasants would sometimes leave their land en masse to protest unfair taxes, harsh conditions, or a cruel lord. This was a radical act, a kind of walking strike, and it was a serious threat to the feudal system. The movement was a way of showing the lord that their power was dependent on the people who worked their land. Without the peasants, the land was worthless. The journey itself became a statement, a slow, deliberate act of defiance. This was a dangerous thing to do. The lords would often send out men-at-arms to stop the peasants, and the punishment for such an act could be severe, but for many, the risk was worth it. It was a way of reclaiming a small piece of their own destiny. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historical records mention cases where entire villages would move to a new location, often to a less populated or less controlled area. In a collective act of protest, this wasn't a sudden flight, but a planned, slow migration, with people moving their homes and belongings over a period of weeks or even months. Historians still argue whether these were successful in the long run or simply led to more hardship, but they offer a tantalizing glimpse into a form of grassroots political action. The journey was a way of exercising the one power you had, the power of your feet. You could not fight a lord's army, but you could leave, and in a world where land was everything, the departure of your labor was a powerful blow. The path you walk is not just a road, it's a political statement, a slow, silent revolution. And with every step, you are not just a tired traveler, you are part of a larger, collective movement. A slow tide of humanity that could change the face of a kingdom. You're back on the open road. But it's not the silence of the forest that fills your ears. It's a cacophony of 1,000 different sounds. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The soundscape of medieval travel was incredibly loud and diverse. Forget the quiet hum of a car engine or the gentle rustle of leaves. The road was a symphony of animal sounds, human voices, and the relentless noise of movement. You would hear the clip-clop of a horse's hooves, the creak and groan of wooden cartwheels, and the lowing of cattle being driven to market. The air would be filled with the sounds of people shouting, singing, and arguing in a mix of different languages and dialects. The sound was not just a side effect of travel, it was an integral part of the experience. It was a way of knowing you were not alone, that there were other people on the road with you. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historical records mention a kind of traveller's bell that some merchants or pilgrims would tie to their packs. The constant, gentle ringing of the bell was a way to announce their presence and to ward off both bandits and wild animals. It was a simple, low-tech form of a car horn. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a charming detail from a few old accounts. But it highlights the constant need for travellers to be aware of their surroundings. The noise also changed depending on the time of day and the location. In the morning, you'd hear the sounds of people waking up and preparing for their journey. In the evening, you'd hear the sounds of people settling down for the night, the crackle of a fire, and the low murmur of conversation. The sounds of a market town were a complete sensory overload, a mix of vendors hawking their wares, blacksmiths hammering, and the general clamour of 1,000 different lives intersecting. Even the sound of a rainstorm would be different on the road. A powerful, drumming noise on the forest canopy that would make you seek shelter. This constant stream of noise was a sign of life, a reassurance in a world that could be terrifyingly silent. The sounds were a map in themselves, a way of knowing where you were and what was happening around you. You would learn to identify the sound of an approaching cart, the distinct lowing of a herd of cows, or the sound of a distant church bell. These sounds were your constant companions, a soundtrack to your long, arduous journey. And as you walk, you find yourself listening, not just with your ears, but with your entire body. The journey continues, but now it's not just a journey for you, it's a potential vector for something much more sinister. A mainstream historical fact is that disease was a constant travel companion in the medieval world, and the movement of people, particularly along major trade and pilgrimage routes, was a primary way that plagues and epidemics spread. You are a walking, breathing risk to every village you pass through. Without any knowledge of germs or sanitation, a simple cough or a fever could be a sign of a larger, more deadly illness, which you could unknowingly pass on to the next person you sleep next to, the next family you eat with, or the next town you enter. You have no idea if the person who passed you on the road a few miles back was carrying a deadly plague. You have no way of knowing if the water you just drank from that stream was contaminated. The journey was not just a physical challenge, it was a constant immunological test. The thought of catching an illness on the road would be a terrifying one. As there was no doctor or hospital to go to, your only recourse would be to find a place to rest, hope for the best, and pray to a saint for a miracle. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some villages had a kind of early quarantine system. If a traveller looked sick, they would be told to stay outside the village walls or in a separate, isolated building until they were either better or dead. This was not an act of cruelty, but a desperate measure of self-preservation. It was a clear-cut choice between the life of a single stranger and the lives of the entire community. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of particularly paranoid villagers. But it speaks to the immense fear of contagion, the Black Death. One of the most devastating pandemics in human history, is a prime example of how travel fueled the spread of disease. It travelled along trade routes, from port to port, and then inland along the very paths you're walking. Every footstep was a potential point of transmission. The journey, for a sick traveller, was a death march. Not just for them, but for everyone they came into contact with. You would have to be constantly on guard, not just against bandits, but against the invisible, microscopic enemies that could be lurking in every puddle, on every hand you shook, and in every shared meal. The road was a gauntlet of biological warfare. Your journey continues, but the landscape around you is a barren, bleak reflection of a recent, terrible memory. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, which was a period of widespread starvation and disease, had a profound impact on peasant travel. The constant cycle of crop failures and bad weather meant that there was no longer a surplus of food to share with travellers. The hospitality that you relied on earlier was now a thing of the past. The journey, once a difficult but possible undertaking, became a desperate, often deadly, search for food. You would be walking through a countryside that was eerily silent. The sounds of a bustling market town or the lowing of cattle were gone, replaced by the quiet despair of a starving population. The people you would meet on the road would not be friendly travellers or welcoming hosts, but gaunt, desperate souls just like you, all searching for a place that had food. The journey was no longer a religious pilgrimage or a trip to a market. It was a desperate race against time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that during the Great Famine, a new kind of traveller emerged, the famine pilgrim. A person who would travel to distant holy sites not just to pray for salvation, but to beg for food from the wealthier monasteries that might have a surplus. It was a fusion of faith and desperation, a last-ditch effort to survive. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly devout souls, but it highlights the sheer terror of a world without food. The famine changed the very nature of the road. It was no longer a social artery, but a vein of misery and death. The inns and taverns that you relied on earlier would have been empty, their owners either dead or on the brink of starvation. The journey was a slow, agonizing walk towards an uncertain future, with no guarantee that you would find what you were looking for. The famine was a great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a peasant, a merchant, or a lord. Hunger was a universal enemy. After a famine, you learn that trusting the kindness of strangers isn't always enough. You need something more, something to protect your few, precious belongings. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Early forms of travel insurance existed, but not in the way we think of it today. It was a community-based, often informal system designed to protect a traveler's possessions against loss, theft, or damage. You wouldn't buy a policy from a company. You would rely on a network of people or a guild to vouch for you and your goods. For a peasant, this might have been an agreement with a trusted neighbour or a family member to look after their small land plot or meagre possessions while they were away. An unspoken contract of mutual aid. This was less about financial reimbursement and more about social security. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain religious fraternities or brotherhoods would offer a form of pilgrim's pledge, a kind of promise to look after the family of a travelling member in the event of their death or disappearance. It was a spiritual and social safety net, a way to ensure that your family wouldn't starve if you never came back. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just an example of a few particularly charitable organisations, but it speaks to the immense risks of travel. You would have to be constantly on guard. The road was filled with opportunistic thieves and people who would take advantage of a tired, vulnerable traveller. Your only real insurance was your wits and the strength of your small travel group. You would hide your most valuable possessions, perhaps sewing a small coin into the lining of your cloak or burying it in a hidden spot before a dangerous stretch of road. The journey was a constant game of cat and mouse, a test of your ability to outsmart the dangers around you. Remember that earlier feeling of vulnerability? This is what it was all about. You had no one to call for help, no authority to turn to if you were robbed. You were on your own, and your only protection was the trust you had in the people you were with. This is why the journey for a peasant was never just about getting from one place to another. It was a testament to their resilience and their ability to navigate a world without a safety net. Your journey, so far, has been a personal one, but now it's about to intersect with a massive stream of humanity. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Religious relics were a huge draw for travellers and a key driver of pilgrimage routes. The bones of a saint, a piece of the true cross, or a vial of a martyr's blood were believed to possess immense spiritual power, and people would travel for hundreds of miles on foot just to get a glimpse of them. These relics acted as a magnet, pulling people from all walks of life towards a single point on the map. The belief was that by being in the presence of a relic, you could be cured of an illness, have your sins forgiven, or simply be a little bit closer to God. This was a powerful motivator, a force that could make a person endure incredible hardship. You would be walking alongside a mix of people, the truly devout, the desperately sick, and the curious who just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The roads leading to these holy sites were bustling with a constant flow of pilgrims, and it was a crucial part of the road economy. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some merchants would travel along these pilgrimage routes, selling fake relics or bottled holy water to gullible travellers. These charlatans were often a thorn in the side of the church, but they were also a common sight on the road. Historians still argue whether these were a sign of the widespread corruption of the church or simply a clever way for opportunistic entrepreneurs to make a living. But it highlights the blend of faith and commerce that was a part of every journey. The road to a holy site was not just a path, it was a living, breathing community of faith. You would share stories with fellow pilgrims, sing hymns together, and offer each other support in a way that was unique to this kind of journey. The destination was not just a church, it was a spiritual finish line, a point where all the hardship of the journey would be washed away in the presence of something sacred. The pilgrimage wasn't just a trip, it was an act of profound devotion, a long, drawn-out prayer that was as much about the journey as it was about the destination. Your journey continues. But now it's not just a path, it's a series of obstacles. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Bridges and ferries were rare and often costly, presenting a major challenge for any traveller. Most rivers and streams had to be forded, a difficult and dangerous act. You would have to take off your boots, roll up your trousers, and wade through the cold, often fast-moving water. This was not a quick dip, it was a treacherous and often terrifying part of the journey. The water could be deeper than you thought, the current stronger, and the bottom slick with algae and rocks. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some villages had a designated river warden, a person who would help travellers cross a particularly difficult ford for a small fee. This was a form of local, informal service, and the warden would know the best way to cross at different times of the day or in different seasons. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few enterprising villagers, but it speaks to the challenges of navigating a world without modern infrastructure. You think about the simple act of crossing a bridge today, it's a non-event, but in your world, it was a moment of high drama, a test of your resolve and your luck. The few bridges that did exist were often toll bridges, owned by a local lord or a monastery. The cost of crossing could be prohibitive for a poor peasant, and you might have to take a detour of several miles to find a place to ford the river for free. This added extra time and exhaustion to an already difficult journey. The ferry, if you were lucky enough to find one, was also a risky business. The boats were often small and unstable, and the river could be choppy and dangerous. You would have to trust your life to the ferryman, a total stranger who might be in a hurry or not have the best boat. It was a clear-cut transaction of risk and reward. You paid a small fee, and you got a slightly safer way to cross the river. But even then, there was no guarantee of safety. The journey was a constant negotiation with the elements and with the very land itself. You've made it across the river, a small victory. But the dangers of the road are far from over. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Outlaws and bandits were a very real and constant threat to travelers, especially those who looked like they might have something worth stealing. The wilderness between towns was often lawless, a perfect hiding place for people who made their living by preying on the weak. You wouldn't just be worried about a single highwayman, you'd be worried about a small, organized gang who knew the local terrain and had no qualms about using violence. Your best defense, as a peasant, was your obvious lack of wealth. You would be carrying very little, and most bandits would likely see you as not worth the trouble. But this wasn't always a guarantee of safety. A desperate or particularly cruel group of bandits might still take what little you have, or simply attack you for the thrill of it. You would be constantly scanning the trees, listening for sounds that weren't natural, and keeping a wide berth from any stranger you met on a lonely stretch of road. The fear was a constant, low-level hum, a part of the psychological burden of travel. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain inns and taverns acted as unofficial safe houses for travelers. The innkeeper would have an unspoken agreement with the local bandits. The inn was off limits, and in return, the innkeeper would keep an eye out for wealthy-looking travelers and pass on information. This was a form of mutual interest arrangement, a way for both sides to profit from the dangers of the road. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just an example of a few particularly shady innkeepers. But it highlights the complex and often dangerous social network of the medieval road. The way travelers dealt with highwaymen was often by avoidance. You wouldn't fight them, you would simply try to avoid them in the first place. You would travel in a group, preferably a large one, and you would try to travel during the day. You would listen for local rumors and warnings from other travelers. The road was a living map of danger, and your best tool for survival was information. Every conversation with a fellow traveler or an innkeeper was a chance to learn about a particularly dangerous stretch of road or a recent bandit attack. The road was a constant, real-time warning system. You're back on the road, and you see a lone woman walking ahead. The sight is both a comfort and a cause for concern. A mainstream historical fact is that the role of women travelers varied widely depending on their social class and the purpose of their journey. For a peasant woman, traveling alone was even more dangerous than it was for a man. She was a target for not just robbery, but also for assault, and the social and legal systems offered her very little protection. This meant that women almost never traveled alone unless they were in a desperate situation. Women who did travel, especially peasant women, would typically be part of a larger group, a family, a religious pilgrimage group, or a group of other travelers. They would rely on the safety in numbers and the unspoken social contract of mutual protection. Their journeys were often for very specific reasons: a pilgrimage, a visit to a sick relative, or a trip to a market to sell a few goods. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain inns and monasteries had a separate, communal sleeping area for women travelers. This was a form of protection, a way to keep them safe from the dangers of a mixed sleeping area. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly forward-thinking religious houses. But it speaks to the challenges that women faced on the road. The journey for a woman was not just a physical and mental challenge, it was a constant battle against the social and physical dangers of the time. She would have to be constantly on guard, not just against bandits, but against the predatory nature of a society that offered her little in the way of safety. The road for a woman was a place of heightened risk and vulnerability, and as you pass the woman, you give her a small, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bravery it takes to be on this road. You've just passed a traveller with a small bag of tools, a sign of their trade. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Guilds began to play a significant role in regulating travel, especially for artisans and merchants. A guild was a professional association of people who worked in the same trade, like blacksmiths, weavers, or bakers. They set standards for their craft, trained apprentices, and, most importantly for a traveller like you, they offered a kind of protection. A member of a guild, and travelling from one town to another, could find a place to stay and a kind of community in the local chapter of their guild. This was a major advantage for an artisan on the road. A member of the guild would be vouched for, and they could find work, lodging, and a sense of camaraderie in a strange town. The guild was a kind of social and professional safety net, a way to ensure that you weren't taken advantage of and that your work was respected. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some guilds had a secret handshake or a special token that members would show each other to prove their membership and to gain access to the guild's benefits. This was a form of low-tech security, a way to prevent non-members from taking advantage of the system. Historians still argue whether these were a widespread practice or just a fascinating detail from a few old accounts, but it highlights the importance of social networks. The guild also offered a form of travel assistance. If a member of the guild died or was robbed on the road, the local chapter of the guild would help to notify their family and to retrieve their body and belongings. This was a kind of primitive insurance policy, a way to protect yourself and your family from the dangers of the road. The journey, for a member of a guild, was less about a leap of faith and more about a calculated risk. You had a network of people who were looking out for you, a professional community that extended far beyond the walls of your own town. This is a key part of the changing nature of travel in the later medieval period. It became more organized, more professional, and less about the pure, raw survival of the earlier days. The road was no longer just a path of mud and rocks, it was a network of human connections, and the guild was the key that unlocked that network. The air grows colder, and the leaves on the trees begin to turn from green to a fiery gold. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The changing of the seasons was a crucial factor in peasant travel. Journeys were almost always undertaken during the spring, summer, and early autumn. Traveling in winter was a perilous, often impossible, undertaking. The roads would be covered in snow and ice, making them impassable for carts and treacherous for a person on foot. The days were shorter, which meant you had less time to travel, and the nights were long and bitterly cold, a constant threat of freezing to death. The lack of food was also a major concern. The fields would be fallow, and the trees would be bare. There would be no berries to forage or wild animals to hunt. The few inns that were open might be low on supplies, and a kind-hearted homeowner might not have a spare crust of bread to share. The journey was not just a physical challenge, it was a race against the calendar, a desperate dash to reach your destination before the first snows of winter. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain long-distance journeys would be broken up into a series of smaller trips, with the traveller spending the winter in a town or village along the way, waiting for spring to return. This was a kind of primitive wintering over, a way to survive the most difficult part of the year. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly cautious travellers, but it speaks to the immense danger of winter travel. The journey in winter was an act of pure desperation, a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. You would have to be either fleeing a terrible lord or facing a similar disaster at home. The thought of being caught on the road in a blizzard would be a constant, nagging fear. The landscape, once a place of life and growth, would become a silent, white world of death and despair. And as you feel the first crispness of autumn in the air, you quicken your pace, a silent prayer on your lips that you'll reach your destination before the first snow. The wind bites at your face, and the path ahead becomes less distinct, a sign that you are moving deeper into the wilderness. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Peasant travel often followed animal routes and ancient tracks. The roads you walk on were not necessarily man-made. They were often trails forged by centuries of livestock, wild animals, and early humans. The connection to livestock was particularly strong. Farmers would travel along the paths that their cattle or sheep had worn into the earth, a kind of primitive GPS system. The animals knew the most direct path to a watering hole or a fertile patch of grass, and you would simply follow their lead. This connection was not just about navigation, it was also a way of life. A peasant on the road would be attuned to the rhythm of the animals. You would learn to read the signs of their passage, to know if a particular path was safe or if it had been abandoned. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain long-distance livestock routes were a form of primitive map-making. The shepherds who followed these routes would pass on their knowledge to other travellers, a kind of oral tradition of geography. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a fascinating detail from a few old accounts, but it highlights the deep connection between a peasant's life and the natural world. The journey was a constant dialogue with the landscape. You would be walking on a path that had been used for centuries, a silent testament to the countless people and animals who had passed this way before. The path was a living thing, a network of whispers and memories that flowed between communities, and as you walk, you feel a sense of connection to a past that stretches back for generations. A silent procession of humanity and livestock all following the same ancient path. You're back on the open road. But it's not just a journey, it's a chance. A mainstream historical fact is that for a select few, travel could be a path to social mobility. While most peasants were tied to the land and their social status, a long-distance journey could offer a rare opportunity to escape the confines of their birth and find a new life. This wasn't a common occurrence, it was the exception, but it was a powerful motivator for anyone who dared to dream of a better life. A peasant might leave their home to seek a new trade in a distant town, to become an apprentice to a master craftsman, or even to join a new lord's service in a different region. The journey was a gamble, a bet on yourself against a system that was designed to keep you in your place. This was a risky business. Without a lord's permission, you would be a vagrant, a person without a place in the world, and you could be arrested or worse. But for a few, the risk was worth it. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain long-distance pilgrimage routes were also a way for people to disappear from their old lives. You could change your name, your story, and your identity and simply start over in a new town. A blank slate in a world that didn't have a modern record-keeping system. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly clever souls, but it speaks to the power of the open road as a tool for personal freedom. The journey was a chance to reinvent yourself, to shed the skin of your old life and become someone new. You might meet a person on the road who offers you a job, a chance to work for them as a servant or a hired hand in a town far from your old life. You might find a new trade, a new skill, a new life. The journey was a kind of a purgatory, a temporary place of no identity, a transition from your old life to a new, and hopefully better, one. And with every step, you were not just a tired traveller, you were a person with a chance to change their destiny. The journey takes a toll not just on your mind, but on your body. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The physical toll of medieval peasant travel was immense. Your body would be in a constant state of pain, your feet would be covered in blisters, your muscles would ache, and your joints would be sore from the constant, repetitive motion of walking. You would be perpetually hungry and thirsty, and the lack of a varied diet would leave you susceptible to illness. The journey was not a walk, it was a brutal, physical ordeal. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain travellers would fashion a kind of primitive walking stick or staff out of a piece of wood. This was not just for balance, it was also a way to measure the distance you had travelled, a kind of primitive odometer. You would count your steps with the staff, and you would be able to gauge your progress. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a fascinating detail from a few old accounts, but it highlights the ingenuity of a person trying to survive a long journey. The physical risks were also very real. A simple cut or a fall could lead to a life-threatening infection, as there was no such thing as an antibiotic or a hospital. A broken bone could mean the end of your journey, and possibly your life, as you would be unable to travel and would have to rely on the kindness of strangers or hope a local healer was available. The journey was a constant reminder of your own mortality, a test of your body's ability to withstand the hardships of the road, and with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a walking monument to human endurance. You're back on the open road. But it's not a road you've ever been on. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. For a common peasant, maps were non-existent. The idea of a detailed, scaled-down representation of the world was a luxury reserved for scholars, cartographers, and the very wealthy. The maps that did exist were often more like works of art than practical navigation tools. They were filled with fantastical beasts, mythical lands, and allegorical symbols. A world away from the muddy path you're on, you had no way of knowing what lay ahead or how far you had to go. So, how did you find your way around? You relied on a combination of oral tradition, landmarks, and instinct. You would ask for directions from people you met on the road or in a village. The directions would be simple and practical. Follow the river until you see the old oak tree, then turn left at the crossroads and walk for a day. This was a kind of human GPS system, a network of shared knowledge that was passed from person to person. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain religious orders would create simple, hand-drawn maps for pilgrims. These were not to scale, but were a series of pictures and symbols that would guide the traveller from one monastery to the next. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly helpful monks, but it speaks to the need for a practical tool in a world without one. The journey was a constant dialogue with your surroundings. You would learn to read the landscape, to recognize the shape of a hill or the curve of a river, and to know what a particular forest or village looked like. The road was a living map, and you were the one who had to learn how to read it. The journey was a constant test of your memory and your ability to pay attention to the details of the world around you. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a walking cartographer, a person who was creating a mental map of the world. You stopped to adjust the simple pack on your shoulders, a bundle that holds all of your worldly possessions for this journey. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. A traveller's pack was a minimalist's dream, filled only with the barest essentials for survival. You wouldn't be carrying a change of clothes, a book, or any other luxury. Your pack would contain a few simple tools for survival: a sharp knife, a small pouch of dried food, a leather water skin, and perhaps a flint and steel for making fire. These were not just objects, they were your lifeline, your only defense against a hostile world. The knife was your most important tool. It was used for everything from cutting food to defending yourself against a wild animal or a would-be bandit. The flint and steel were a matter of life and death. The ability to make fire meant you could cook your food, purify your water, and, most importantly, stay warm during a cold night. The water skin was a constant concern. You would have to fill it up whenever you came across a clean-looking stream or a well, as there was no guarantee you would find another source for miles. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that travellers would carry a small, hand-carved wooden bowl. This wasn't just for eating, it was also a form of social currency. You would be able to share a meal with a fellow traveller or a kind-hearted homeowner without having to borrow a plate or a bowl. It was a simple, practical way to make yourself a more welcome guest. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly thoughtful travellers. But it speaks to the importance of being prepared for every eventuality. The contents of your pack were a reflection of your life. It was all you had, a small, tangible representation of your existence. You would have to be constantly aware of its weight, of its contents, and of its security. Losing your pack would be a disaster, a sign that your journey was over, and with every step, you were not just carrying a pack, you were carrying your life, and your hopes for a new one. Your journey continues, but with every step, you're not just moving through the world, you're reshaping your understanding of it. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. For a peasant traveller, the concept of home was fundamentally different from the one we know today. Your home wasn't just a house or a village, it was a sense of place, a community, and a network of relationships. The journey, by taking you away from that physical space, forced you to redefine what home meant. It was no longer a fixed point on a map, but a feeling, a memory, and a destination you hoped to return to. You are now a person who has seen more of the world than most people in your village. You have a new perspective, a sense of a larger world that exists beyond your small, familiar life. This is both a blessing and a curse. You have a newfound knowledge and a sense of self-reliance. But you also have a new sense of rootlessness. You are no longer just a peasant tied to the land. You are a traveler, a transient person who has experienced the world in a way that is unique to you. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that this sense of rootlessness was a major psychological challenge for travelers. They would often create small, temporary homes on the road, a small fire pit, a sheltered overhang, a sense of a space that was their own, a way to recreate a sense of a home on the move. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly lonely travelers, but it speaks to the deep human need for a sense of belonging. The journey was a constant dialogue between the physical world and the world in your mind. You would be constantly comparing the new places you saw to the old, the new people you met to the people you left behind. The journey was a long, slow process of redefining yourself, of shedding the old identity of a person who never left their village and becoming a person who had seen the world. And as you walk, you feel a sense of both loss and liberation, a feeling of leaving one home behind and hoping to find a new one. As you trudge along, you feel the familiar ache in your legs, but you also feel a new, lighter sensation in your pack. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Pilgrim tokens and other souvenirs were a common part of the journey. These were not just trinkets, they were tangible proof that you had completed a difficult journey to a holy site. These tokens were often small, mass-produced items made of lead or other cheap metals, often with a simple symbol or a saint's image stamped on them. You would buy them from a vendor near the holy site and then wear them on your cloak or your hat, a kind of medieval badge of honor. These souvenirs were a way to remember your trip, a physical reminder of your faith and your endurance. They were also a way to show others where you had been, a kind of medieval resume of your spiritual life. When you returned home, the token would be a source of pride, a testament to your piety and your courage. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that these tokens were also a form of protection. It was believed that carrying the token would protect you from evil spirits, sickness, or bad luck on your journey. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a fascinating detail from a few old accounts, but it highlights the blend of faith and practicality that was a part of every journey. The act of buying a souvenir was also a way of participating in a larger, commercial world. You were a traveler, a pilgrim, and a customer. The journey was not just a spiritual one, it was a consumer one. The token was a symbol of a successful journey, a physical representation of the hardship you had endured and the spiritual reward you had received. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a walking billboard for a particular holy site. Your journey has been a test of physical and mental endurance. But now you're beginning to feel a shift. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. For a peasant, travel was a profound psychological break from the daily toil of their life. Your existence was a monotonous cycle of waking up, working in the fields, and sleeping, day after day, year after year. The journey was a radical departure from this rhythm. It was a chance to see new places, meet new people, and experience a different way of life. The journey was not just a means to an end, it was an escape, a temporary moment of freedom from the constraints of your social status. You can almost feel the weight of your old life lifting with every step. The worries about your lord's taxes, the state of your crops, and the health of your livestock are all a distant memory. Your only concern is the road ahead, and the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The journey was a form of mental reset, a way to clear your mind and to see the world with fresh eyes. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that the act of walking itself was a form of meditation. The rhythmic motion of your legs, the repetition of the sounds of the road, and the constant change of the landscape would put you in a kind of trance-like state, a state of mind that was free from the constant worries of your daily life. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just a fascinating detail from a few old accounts. But it speaks to the power of the journey as a psychological tool. The journey was a chance to hear stories from a different world, to see things you had only ever heard about in legends, and to meet people who were nothing like the people you grew up with. It was a kind of a waking dream, a temporary suspension of reality, and with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a person who was discovering the world, and in the process, discovering yourself. Your journey has been a test of endurance, but now you see a sight that makes you feel a new kind of worry. A family is walking along the road, the children small and tired, the old man slow and frail. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Children and the elderly rarely travelled. The logistical and physical challenges were simply too great. A child's small legs couldn't keep up with the pace of an adult, and they would be a constant source of worry and a drag on the journey. The elderly, with their tired bones and weakened bodies, were even more vulnerable. A journey that would be difficult for a young, strong person would be a death march for someone who was old or sick. The lack of proper nutrition and the constant exposure to the elements would be a major health risk for both groups. A small cough for a child could turn into a life-threatening illness, and a fall for an elderly person could be a broken bone that would never heal properly. The journey was a kind of a filter, thus a brutal, physical test that only the strong and the able-bodied could pass. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that families would sometimes carry a small, hand-woven basket or a kind of primitive cradle for a small child, a way to carry them for short distances on the back of a donkey or a horse. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly resourceful families, but it speaks to the challenges of travelling with children. The journey was a constant negotiation between the needs of the family and the needs of the road. You would have to stop more often, carry more food and water, and be constantly on guard for a child who might wander off or a parent who might fall ill. The road was a place of heightened vulnerability for those who were not in their prime. And as you pass the family, you feel a sense of shared humanity, a silent acknowledgement of the bravery and the desperation it takes to travel with those who are most vulnerable. As you walk, your nose is your first guide. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The smell of the road was unforgettable and a constant part of the journey. It was a sensory map, a living, breathing guide to the world around you. The smells would change depending on your location, the time of day, and the weather. You would smell the damp earth after a rainstorm, the sweet scent of wild flowers in a field, and the sharp, acrid smell of a blacksmith's forge in a distant town. The smells were a way of knowing where you were and what was happening around you, but not all smells were pleasant. The road would also be a constant source of foul odours. You would smell the manure of passing animals, the unwashed bodies of other travellers, and the stench of uncollected waste in a town or village. The smell of a butcher's shop would be a mix of fresh meat and blood, and the smell of a tannery would be a powerful, chemical assault on your senses. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain travellers would carry a small pouch of fragrant herbs, a kind of primitive potpourri, to try and mask the terrible smells of the road. This was a simple, low-tech way to make the journey a little more bearable. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly fastidious travellers, but it speaks to the challenges of navigating a world without modern sanitation. The smell of the road was a constant reminder of your place in the world. You were a traveller, a person who was constantly moving through a world that was often dirty and unhygienic. The smells were a part of your identity, a kind of living, breathing memory of your journey. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey. You were a person who was experiencing the world with all of your senses. Your journey continues. But now, it's not just a journey, it's a legal minefield. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The legal status of a traveller was complex and often precarious. You were a person without a fixed home, a transient, and you were often viewed with suspicion by the local authorities. You had no rights in a new town, and you were at the mercy of the local lord or the town's legal system. A person without a lord or a village to vouch for them was an outcast, a person who could be accused of any crime and have little recourse. The very act of being on the road made you a person of interest, and you had to be constantly on guard. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain towns had a special traveller's law or a separate set of rules that applied only to transient people. These laws were often harsher than the ones for the locals, and they were designed to keep travelers from staying for too long or causing trouble. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly xenophobic towns, but it speaks to the challenges of navigating a world without a modern legal system. The legal status of a traveler was a constant source of anxiety. You could be accused of a crime you didn't commit, and you would have no one to speak for you. You would be at the mercy of a local lord or a judge who had no reason to trust you. The journey was a constant reminder of your own powerlessness, a test of your ability to navigate a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a person who was constantly on the wrong side of the law. You're back on the open road, but it's not a lonely path anymore. The path is wider, more crowded, and filled with a sense of purpose. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Trade fairs became massive travel hubs. These were not just a single market, they were huge. Multi-day events that would draw people from all over a region, or even a kingdom. They were a mix of commerce, entertainment, and social gathering. A kind of medieval festival where you could buy anything from a new plough to a rare spice. The journey to a trade fair was an event in itself. You would be walking alongside a mix of people, merchants with their goods, entertainers with their instruments, and ordinary people like you who were just there to see what was happening. The air would be filled with a sense of excitement and anticipation. The fairs were often held in a field outside of a major town, and for a few days, the field would become a bustling, temporary city. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain trade fairs had a special travellers' quarter, where people from different regions would set up their temporary homes, a kind of medieval, international village. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly well-organised fairs. But it speaks to the immense scale of these events. The fair was a kind of a pilgrimage of commerce, a place where people would come to buy, sell, and trade. It was a place where you could hear news from a distant land, see a new invention, or simply marvel at the wealth and diversity of the world. The journey to the fair was a slow, deliberate trudge towards a place of a temporary freedom, a place where the rules of your daily life didn't apply, and you were just another person in a crowd. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a person who was participating in a grand, and very old, human tradition. You're sitting by a fire at a trade fair, surrounded by the sights and smells of 100 different cultures. You're exhausted from the journey, but you're also filled with a new energy. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Stories and songs were shared on the road, a form of oral tradition that was a crucial part of the journey. The travellers you met on the road were not just people, they were living, breathing storytellers, carriers of news, rumours, and tales from a world you had only ever dreamed of. The journey was a constant exchange of information, a slow, deliberate conversation between people from different places and different lives. You would listen to a merchant from a distant land tell a story about a king and a kingdom you had never heard of. You would hear a pilgrim sing a hymn in a language you didn't understand, but the melody would be beautiful all the same. You would hear a farmer tell a bawdy joke that made you laugh out loud. The stories and songs were a way to pass the time, to forget the hardships of the road, and to connect with other people. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain travelling bards or minstrels would sell subscriptions to their stories. You would pay a small fee, and the bard would tell you a new chapter of a long, epic poem every time you saw them on the road. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly entrepreneurial performers, but it speaks to the value of a good story. The journey was a constant stream of new information, a kind of a living newspaper. You would hear about new harvests, new laws, and new battles. You would hear about a lord who had fallen out of favour, or a new saint who had performed a miracle. The road was a living, breathing network of information, and you were a part of it. And with every story you heard, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a person who was learning about the world, and in the process, becoming a part of its story. The noise and clamour of the trade fair are a distant memory now. You're on the final leg of your journey, and you can feel it in every muscle and bone. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The end of a journey was a huge event, a moment of profound relief and emotional release. You would have been walking for weeks or even months, and the destination would be more than just a place on the map. It would be a symbolic finish line, a point where all the hardship of the journey would finally end. You would feel a mix of exhaustion, elation, and a deep sense of accomplishment. You might stop just before the final approach, taking a moment to wash your face in a stream, to straighten your clothes, and to prepare yourself for the final entry. The arrival would be a powerful, emotional moment. You might fall to your knees in a church, crying tears of relief. You might embrace a family member you hadn't seen in years. The journey was a long, slow process of separation and reunion, and the arrival was the culmination of that process. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain pilgrims would bring a small rock or a piece of their home earth with them on their journey. When they arrived at their destination, they would place the rock on a cairn or a monument, a kind of symbolic act of a successful completion. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an example of a few particularly sentimental travelers, but it speaks to the emotional weight of a long journey. The arrival was also a time of sharing your story. You would be a living, breathing testament to the power of the road. You would tell your friends and family about the places you had seen, the people you had met, and the hardships you had endured. Your journey would become a part of the local lore, a story that would be told around the fire for years to come. The journey was not just a personal experience, it was a communal one, a story that belonged to everyone. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a person who was bringing a new story to the world. Your journey is complete, but its impact is far from over. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The small, arduous journeys of medieval peasants laid the groundwork for later. Massive human migrations, the paths you walked, the inns you stayed in, and the social networks you relied on were the primitive infrastructure for a future world. The very idea of a long-distance journey, once a rare and terrifying event, became a part of the human experience. The lessons learned, the stories told, and the traditions created on these early journeys were passed down from generation to generation, and they shaped the way people would think about travel for centuries to come. The journey was a crucible, a place where new skills were learned and new ideas were forged. The ingenuity of a peasant on the road, the way they learned to navigate without a map or find food in the wilderness, were skills that would be crucial for the great explorations and migrations of the later centuries. The pilgrim was the precursor to the explorer, the merchant was the precursor to the trader, and the peasant was the precursor to the colonist. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that the folk songs and ballads of the time were a form of oral history, a way to pass on knowledge about the dangers of the road, the best places to find food, and the best ways to deal with local lords. The journey was not just a physical act, it was an act of a knowledge transfer. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious effort or just a natural consequence of a culture that relied on oral tradition, but it speaks to the power of the journey as a tool for learning. The journey was a slow, deliberate form of human evolution. It was a test of our resilience, our ingenuity, and our ability to adapt to a changing world. And with every step, you were not just a person on a journey, you were a part of a larger, global migration, a slow tide of humanity that would eventually spread across the entire planet. The road was a living, breathing history book, and you were one of its first authors. Your long journey is now coming to an end. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The legacy of medieval peasant travel is still with us today. The roads you walked on, the traditions you created, and the stories you told are all a part of our shared human history. The very idea of travel as a form of self-discovery, of a spiritual journey, or as a way to find a better life is a legacy of the peasants who first dared to leave their villages and see the world. The journey was a slow, deliberate form of human evolution, a testament to our resilience and our ability to adapt. The paths that were once narrow dirt tracks are now paved roads and highways. The inns you stayed in are now hotels and motels. The stories you told around the fire are now books and movies. The world has changed, but the fundamental human need to explore and to move is still with us. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historians believe that certain modern-day traditions, like the practice of taking a gap year to travel, are a subconscious echo of the peasant's journey. It's a way to break free from the rhythm of modern life and to find yourself in the world, just as a peasant would have done centuries ago. Historians still argue whether this is a direct connection or just a fascinating coincidence, but it speaks to the enduring power of the journey. The peasants' journey was not just a historical event, it was a human one. It was a story of hope, of fear, of endurance, and of a deep, abiding faith in the future. The road was a living, breathing monument to human history, and you were a part of it. The journey was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a way of life, and a constant reminder that the world was bigger than your village. And as you feel the last bit of the road under your feet, you feel a sense of peace, a sense of a job well done. The journey is over, but the story is just beginning. Now, as the embers of the fire glow in the dark, and the soft hum of the night surrounds you, let your thoughts drift, the long miles behind you, the dust on your boots, the songs of the road, they all fade into a gentle mist. The stories you heard, the faces you saw, the kindness you received, they settle like soft down, a comforting blanket. You are not just here, you are the sum of all your steps. A traveller who has reached the end of their path for tonight, the world outside, with its endless roads and its distant lights, can wait until morning. For now, there is only this moment, this quiet stillness. You have walked a long way, and your body and mind are ready for rest. Let the air grow soft, the sounds recede, and the calm of the night come to you. You are home for tonight. In the safety of your own mind, the journey is over. The story is complete, and the only thing left to do is drift away. End of script. Sweet dreams.